A former Marine stopped at a red light 3 years too late, carrying nothing but a silence that never left him, and a German shepherd who refused to forget. After an 18-wheeler tore through an intersection and shattered his world, the official report called it mechanical failure. Case closed. But grief does not close so easily. When his daughter's final drawing revealed a detail no one had noticed, he began to see what others had missed. Cropped photos, altered logs, warnings buried beneath contracts and signatures. And as the truth surfaced, so did something deeper, a choice between revenge and redemption. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Snow drifted in thin, gray sheets across Main Street, softening headlights and muting the sound of passing cars, as if the city itself wanted to forget what had happened at the corner of Main and 7th. 3 years earlier, that intersection had burned itself into Daniel Brooks's memory with merciless clarity. The light had turned red, Emily's sedan had slowed, and then an 18-wheeler had torn through the crossing as if the color meant nothing. The impact folded metal like paper. By the time Daniel arrived, the world was reduced to flashing sirens and a white sheet trembling in the cold wind. Daniel Brooks was 42 now, tall and broad-shouldered, built like the Marine he had been for nearly 2 decades. His jaw was angular, shadowed by a dark beard he kept trimmed but never neat. The first streaks of gray threading through it earlier than they should have. A shrapnel injury overseas had left his left shoulder slightly stiff, and in winter he moved with a faint guardedness, as though bracing for impact that never quite stopped coming. His steel-gray eyes appeared steady to strangers, but anyone who had known him before the accident would have noticed the distance in them, the way he seemed to stand half a step outside his own life. Emily Brooks had been his opposite in almost every way. She was 38 when she died, tall and slender, with warm, honey-brown hair that fell just past her shoulders, and skin so fair it freckled in the Montana sun. She taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school in Bozeman, the kind of teacher who knelt to meet children at eye level and remembered the names of their pets. Her voice was calm without being timid, firm without being sharp. She believed in rules, not because she feared disorder, but because she believed structure kept people safe. Daniel used to tease her about that, about her habit of pausing at yellow lights, even when no cars were in sight. She would smile and say, "Someone always comes when you think they won't." Their daughter Lily had inherited Emily's gentleness and Daniel's watchfulness. At 9, she was small for her age, all elbows and bright eyes. With a tumble of dark blonde hair she refused to brush properly. She loved drawing animals, especially Titan, and carried a sketchbook everywhere. She had the curious habit of studying people longer than was polite, as if she sensed stories hiding in plain sight. A week before the accident, she had attended a town meeting with Emily at the Civic Hall, sitting on the curb outside afterward to draw a large white truck parked near the entrance. The official report concluded the collision had been caused by sudden brake system failure. No evidence of intent, no criminal conspiracy. The driver, Mark Delaney, served a short sentence for safety violations and negligent driving. Case closed. Mark Delaney was a broad man in his mid-40s, with a weathered face and thinning sandy hair, the kind of long-haul trucker who had spent years under open sky and tighter deadlines. In court, he had looked smaller than his build suggested, shoulders rounded, voice subdued. He claimed the brake pedal had gone soft just before the intersection. Investigators found mechanical wear. The city moved on. Daniel did not. He left the Marine Corps 6 months later. Officially, it was a voluntary separation. Unofficially, he could no longer function in crowds, nor could he stand the sight of a red traffic light without feeling his pulse spike, as if preparing for incoming fire. Combat had trained him to react to chaos. It had not trained him to survive stillness. Now he lived in a modest one-story house on the outskirts of Bozeman, near a line of dark pines that absorbed the worst of the wind. He worked alone at a small auto garage he had purchased with his retirement savings. Engines made sense. Steel obeyed physics. Parts either fit or they did not. There was comfort in that. Titan was the only reason Daniel stepped outside when he did not have to. The German Shepherd was 8 years old, large and powerfully built, his sable coat thick and brushed with silver along the muzzle. A faint scar marked his right flank from a roadside blast overseas, a memory he carried without complaint. His amber eyes missed nothing. In service, Titan had specialized in detection and perimeter security, moving with disciplined precision rather than aggression. Retirement had softened his pace, but not his vigilance. He followed Daniel room to room, not anxiously but deliberately, as if assigned to guard a perimeter that had shrunk to the size of one broken household. One evening, snow tapping softly against the windows, Daniel pulled a storage box from the back of his closet. Titan lifted his head from the rug but did not rise. Inside the box were Lily's drawings, construction paper birthday cards, and a small pair of gloves with one finger torn at the seam. Daniel sat on the floor, back against the bed, and sorted them slowly, forcing his breathing to remain steady. Near the bottom, he found a sheet of white paper folded twice. The crayon strokes were bold and slightly uneven. A large white truck filled most of the page, its trailer drawn carefully with straight blue lines. On the side, in oversized block letters, Lily had written, "Del Trans Logistics." Daniel frowned. He remembered the town meeting Emily had attended about heavy truck traffic near residential areas. Lily must have drawn the vehicle outside the Civic Hall. He could almost see her sitting cross-legged on the curb, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. He stood and walked to his desk. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a folder containing the accident documents he had avoided for years. He spread the photographs across the surface, his hands steady by force of habit. The official image of the truck at the intersection showed the rear half of the trailer, but the section where a logo would appear had been cropped out of frame. He stared at it longer than he meant to. Titan rose then, coming to stand beside him, muzzle resting lightly against Daniel's thigh. The dog's ears tilted forward, as if reading the tension in the air. Daniel turned to his laptop and accessed the city's public records portal. It took longer than he expected, but eventually he located an archived file labeled Supplemental Scene Photos, Unedited. He opened the first image. The same truck, the same intersection. But this time, the rear panel was fully visible. The logo was clear, centered, impossible to miss. Del Trans Logistics. Daniel did not feel rage. Not yet. What he felt was something colder, something steadier. The quiet recognition that a detail had been moved out of sight. He glanced down at Lily's drawing again, at the careful letters pressed hard into paper by small, determined hands. Titan's tail gave a single, slow sweep against the floor. For 3 years, Daniel had believed the red light was the last thing that mattered. Now, staring at 2 versions of the same photograph, he understood that something else had turned against him that day. Not fate, not chance, but omission. Outside, a traffic signal at the distant highway shifted from green to yellow to red. Daniel did not look away this time. The next morning broke brittle and pale over Bozeman, frost clinging to the edges of Daniel's garage windows as if the night had tried to hold on longer than it should. Daniel did not sleep much. He sat at the small kitchen table until dawn, Lily's drawing on one side, the 2 accident photos on the other. Titan lay beneath the table, chin on his paws, eyes half closed but alert in the way only a trained working dog could manage, resting without surrendering awareness. Daniel did not storm into the police department. He had learned, both in combat and in grief, that reckless motion often destroyed more than it solved. Instead, he made a phone call. Detective Rachel Hayes answered on the 3rd ring. Rachel Hayes was 34, medium height with an athletic build that spoke of early mornings spent running rather than late nights at bars. Her dark hair was usually pulled into a tight low bun, practical and no-nonsense, and a thin scar traced the edge of her right eyebrow, left over from a collision scene 2 years ago, when a distracted driver had clipped her while she directed traffic. The incident had sharpened her already methodical nature. She moved carefully through facts, unwilling to trust quick conclusions. Her gray-green eyes carried a habit of measuring people before speaking. They met that afternoon in a modest office inside the Bozeman Police Department. Rachel listened without interrupting as Daniel laid the 2 photographs side by side and placed Lily's drawing between them. He spoke evenly, but his voice carried a weight that did not lift. Rachel leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled beneath her chin. "Del Trans," she said quietly. "You're not the first person to bring that name back to me." She turned her computer screen toward him and pulled up a spreadsheet. Over the past 5 years, Del Trans Logistics had been involved in 4 significant traffic accidents within Montana. Each had been ruled a separate mechanical failure, isolated, unfortunate, non-criminal. Different drivers, different routes, the same company. "Last year," Rachel continued, "I worked a case up near Livingston. A tanker drifted into oncoming traffic. Brake lag. Driver swore he reported it days earlier." She paused. "We couldn't prove negligence." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. "If you want to look deeper," she said, "we do it correctly. We request maintenance logs through FOIA, public records, no trespassing, no accusations." Daniel nodded once. He had no interest in becoming the story. The request took several days. In that time, Daniel returned to his routine at the garage, but his movements felt rehearsed. Titan watched him more closely than usual, tail giving small, deliberate movements when Daniel lingered too long over paperwork. The dog seemed especially alert whenever Daniel unfolded copies of the accident report, nostrils flaring as though old oil and scorched rubber still clung to the pages. When the maintenance records arrived electronically, Rachel called him back in. They reviewed them side by side. The log from the day of the accident listed the truck's vehicle ID number and driver, Mark Delaney. Under driver notes, a line stood out in plain text. "Brake pedal soft. Requires inspection before next long-haul dispatch." Daniel exhaled slowly. 45 minutes later in the log, an entry appeared. "Issue resolved. Cleared for route. Electronic authorization confirmed." Rachel frowned. 45 minutes is tight for a full brake line inspection on an 18-wheeler. "Too tight," Daniel said. She zoomed in on the digital signature. The authorization did not belong to a certified mechanic. It belonged to Charles Whitmore, Director of Operations at Del Trans Logistics. Daniel had never met Whitmore. Rachel pulled up his profile. Charles Whitmore was 55, tall and lean, with silver hair combed carefully back from a high forehead. His face was narrow, his mouth thin and controlled, the kind of man who smiled without showing teeth. Former MBA, promoted internally from logistics management. No technical certifications listed. "He's not a mechanic," Daniel said. "No," Rachel agreed. "He shouldn't be clearing brake systems." Daniel left the station and drove to the address listed on the maintenance record. The repair facility no longer bore Del Trans signage. It had been sold the previous year. A new sign read Bridger Fleet Services. Inside, the air smelled of diesel and warm metal. The current owner, a stocky man in his early 50s named Harold Finch, greeted Daniel with wary politeness. Finch had thick forearms, permanently stained knuckles, and thinning gray hair beneath a faded baseball cap. Years under trucks had given him a permanent stoop and a voice roughened by engine noise. When Daniel mentioned the date of the accident and the truck ID number, Finch scratched his jaw thoughtfully. "That was before my time. I bought this place 2 years ago, but I kept most of the old records in storage." He disappeared into a back room and returned with a cardboard file box layered in dust. Daniel and Finch flipped through paper copies of older work orders. The invoice for that truck appeared, oil change, tire rotation, dated 3 days before the accident. There was no record of a brake repair on the day in question. Finch tapped the page. If they had brought it back in for brake work, it would be here. We log everything. Liability reasons. Could it have been serviced elsewhere? Daniel asked. Maybe, Finch said, but not here, and not in 45 minutes. Not properly. Daniel drove back in silence. Titan rested his head against the passenger door, eyes scanning the horizon as if mapping unseen routes. Daniel's thoughts did not race. They narrowed. He had lived in a world where shortcuts cost lives. He recognized the shape of one now. That evening, Rachel called. "I ran Whitmore's authorization against internal timestamps," she said. "The digital clearance was issued remotely from company headquarters." "Not from the repair yard." Daniel stared at the wall, seeing instead the intersection at Main and 7th. "So the truck never returned for repair," he said quietly. "No," Rachel replied. "And the man who signed off on the brakes wasn't even on site." Daniel folded Lily's drawing carefully and placed it back into the box, but he did not close the lid this time. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the edge of his property, its brakes sighing softly as it slowed for a stop sign. Daniel listened until the sound faded. The log had spoken. The truck had been cleared without being repaired, and the man who cleared it had no right to touch a brake system at all. A hard wind moved across the Gallatin Valley that week, flattening dry grass along the roadside and carrying with it the metallic scent of early winter. Daniel noticed the wind more than usual. It had a direction, a persistence. Patterns mattered. He had built his former life on recognizing them before they closed in. Rachel Hayes spread printed case summaries across the long conference table in a small review room at the station. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Daniel stood instead of sitting, hands braced lightly against the back of a chair. Titan waiting outside in the patrol lobby under the watch of a uniformed officer who didn't mind dogs but kept a cautious eye on him nonetheless. Rachel had pulled files from 4 separate incidents over 5 years. Different counties. Different routes, different cargo. But each involved a Deltrans vehicle, and each report included some version of mechanical failure. Brake lag, hydraulic delay, worn components that should have been replaced earlier. She tapped the margins of the reports where dispatch times and contract deadlines were noted. "Look at the dates," she said. "Each accident occurred within weeks of a major contract renewal or delivery deadline." Her voice remained steady, but there was a tightening around her eyes that Daniel recognized as focus turning into conviction. They charted timelines on a whiteboard. Vehicle inspection warnings appeared days before departure. Maintenance flagged as pending. Yet dispatch clearance was granted regardless. Rachel accessed internal procurement records obtained through a subpoena request initiated after the maintenance anomaly surfaced. Deltrans had been pushing to secure a significant fourth-quarter municipal hauling contract, worth millions. Meeting delivery benchmarks would have guaranteed renewal. Daniel studied the board in silence. In the Marines, patterns often meant ambush. Here, the pattern was quieter, but no less lethal. Rachel pulled another document from her folder. "Mark Delaney was released early for good behavior and cooperation," she said. "He agreed to a plea deal. Reduced time served." She paused. "You should talk to him." Daniel hesitated only briefly before agreeing. The next afternoon, he drove south toward a modest rental house outside town. Titan rode in the back seat, alert but calm. The property was small, with peeling white paint and a sagging porch railing. A pickup truck sat in the driveway, older model, dented but functional. Mark Delaney opened the door after a long knock. He looked older than in the courtroom photograph Daniel remembered. His sandy hair had thinned further, and his once broad shoulders seemed rounded inward. Stubble covered his jaw unevenly, and faint lines cut deeper into his face than 3 years alone should have allowed. His hands were large, calloused from decades behind a steering wheel, and he held the door frame as if steadying himself. "You're Brooks," Mark said quietly. It was not a question. Daniel nodded. "I'm not here for a fight." Mark's gaze dropped briefly to Titan, who stood beside Daniel without tension. After a moment, Mark stepped aside and let them in. The living room was sparsely furnished. A worn couch, a small television, Unopened mail stacked on the coffee table. They sat across from each other. Mark's voice carried fatigue, but not defiance. "I've replayed that day more times than I can count," he said. "The brake pedal didn't fail at the intersection. It felt wrong before I even left the yard. Soft, spongy." He swallowed. "I logged it." Daniel's expression did not change. "We saw the log." Mark gave a short, humorless laugh. 45 minutes later, it was cleared. I never saw a mechanic. They told me dispatch would handle it. Said I was overreacting." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "After the crash, I told investigators I'd reported the issue. That's when company counsel showed up. Said if I stuck to the story of sudden failure and didn't imply prior negligence, they'd make sure I wasn't buried under charges. I had 2 kids in high school. I signed what they put in front of me." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Mark's eyes flickered toward Titan, then back. "I'm not saying I'm innocent. I was behind that wheel. But those brakes were weak before I hit Main Street. I told them." When Daniel left the house, the wind felt sharper. Titan walked close at his side, as if reading the weight shifting inside him. Back at the station, Rachel had new information. She had secured internal emails through a cooperating source who requested anonymity. She handed Daniel a printed excerpt. The sender, Charles Whitmore. The message was dated 3 weeks before the accident. "Delay maintenance until Q4 contract closes. Reassign priority after renewal." Rachel looked up. "It's not a smoking gun for intent to kill," she said carefully, "but it establishes motive to defer repairs." Daniel nodded slowly. He did not want a murder conspiracy. He wanted the truth to be as plain as steel. Rachel continued. "There's something else." She opened another file, this one from the city clerk's archive. A public complaint submitted online 2 weeks before the crash. The complainant? Emily Brooks. Rachel turned the monitor toward him. The complaint cited heavy truck traffic near residential areas and expressed concern about safety at the Main and 7th intersection. The language was calm, precise, consistent with the woman Daniel remembered, structured, careful, unwilling to exaggerate. She had requested additional signage and stricter enforcement. Daniel read the message twice. He could almost hear her voice in the phrasing. "She wasn't targeted," Rachel said gently. "There's no evidence of that. But she was on record. A concerned citizen flagging risk at the exact intersection." Daniel exhaled slowly. It was not a conspiracy aimed at his family. It was something colder. A system choosing speed over caution, profit over pause. Rachel leaned back. "If we establish a pattern of deferred maintenance tied to contract pressure, this becomes corporate negligence on a scale larger than a single accident." Daniel's eyes returned to the email from Whitmore. Delay maintenance. Outside, a patrol car passed through the lot, its tires crunching lightly on gravel. Titan, waiting just beyond the doorway, lifted his head but did not bark. Daniel understood now that the red light had not been the only warning ignored that day. There had been others, logged, deferred, signed off remotely. He folded the copy of Emily's complaint and placed it carefully into his jacket pocket. The pattern was no longer a suspicion. It was documented, and the woman who had paused at yellow lights had tried, quietly, to make the road safer before the system chose not to listen. The first real snow came early that year, laying a thin white skin over the slopes of Bridger Canyon and turning the asphalt into something deceptively calm. Daniel had always distrusted surfaces that looked quiet. 2 days after Rachel formally submitted her request to reopen the maintenance review, Daniel's garage received a visit from the Montana Department of Revenue. The inspection van arrived just after noon, crisp government lettering on its doors, engine idling longer than necessary before cutting off. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward as 2 men exited. The taller of the 2 introduced himself as Thomas Avery, mid-40s, narrow-faced with carefully parted brown hair and rectangular glasses that magnified sharp, observant eyes. His posture was straight, practiced, and his handshake firm without warmth. He wore a charcoal overcoat too polished for a routine field audit. The second man, younger and broader, carried a tablet and avoided eye contact, moving with the quiet compliance of someone following instructions rather than leading them. "Random compliance audit," Avery said smoothly. "Standard procedure." Daniel nodded. He had nothing to hide. His books were clean, taxes paid on time, permits renewed annually. He led them through the small office, through tool storage, through invoice binders. Titan watched from the far corner, body relaxed but head slightly lowered, eyes tracking Avery's movements with unblinking focus. The inspection lasted 3 hours. They found nothing. When they left, Avery paused at the door. "These things tend to follow patterns," he said lightly, adjusting his gloves. "Businesses under scrutiny sometimes experience additional review." Daniel met his gaze. "For what?" Avery smiled thinly. "Just a general observation." The van pulled away, tires crunching over gravel. Daniel stood in the doorway longer than necessary. Titan stepped beside him, ears forward, tail still. The dog had sensed the tension, not the paperwork. That evening, Rachel called. "I didn't request any financial review," she said. "And I've confirmed the audit was flagged through a separate administrative channel. I'm checking why." Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, looking out at the tree line darkening under fresh snow. "Pressure," he said quietly. He did not tell her he expected worse. 3 nights later, Daniel drove north through Bridger Canyon after finishing late at the garage. The road curved sharply along the mountainside, guardrails sparse in places where rock cut close to pavement. Snow fell lightly, not enough to close the road, but enough to disguise patches of ice. Titan sat upright in the passenger seat, paws braced against the dashboard. His breathing was steady, but his ears shifted frequently, tracking sounds beyond the engine's hum. Daniel had long ago learned to trust those subtle changes. Titan did not startle easily. When he grew alert, there was reason. Headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. A large vehicle, too large for the narrow lane to feel comfortable. Daniel eased slightly toward the center of his lane to signal awareness. The vehicle behind did not slow. Titan's body stiffened. The truck accelerated. Daniel's pulse sharpened. He glanced into the mirror. A commercial rig, white cab, no obvious company markings visible in the dark. It drew closer, closer still, until the grille nearly filled the rear window. Then the horn blared once, long and aggressive. Daniel gripped the steering wheel firmly, but did not panic. Panic, on a mountain road, killed faster than metal. He maintained speed. The truck edged left as if to pass, but remained directly behind him, its high beams flooding the cab with blinding light. Titan gave a low, controlled rumble, not a bark, but a warning. Ahead, a curve bent sharply along a stretch known for black ice. Daniel felt it before he saw it, the slight resistance in the steering, the faint drift under the tires. The truck behind surged forward again, closing the gap to almost nothing. It wasn't an accident. Daniel eased his foot off the accelerator instead of braking. Sudden braking would spin them. The truck swerved right, forcing Daniel toward the outer edge of the lane where snow had drifted thicker. Titan shifted, bracing himself, muscles coiled. For a split second, Daniel's mind returned to another vehicle, another intersection. He forced the image away. This was not then. He adjusted the wheel gently, counter-steering into the slide as the right tires touched the icy shoulder. The truck's engine roared beside him, attempting to overtake on the narrowest part of the curve. There was no contact, no collision, just inches. The truck surged ahead at the last moment, cutting sharply in front of him before disappearing around the bend, taillights swallowed by snowfall. Daniel steadied the wheel until the road straightened. His breath came controlled, measured. Titan's low growl faded as the engine noise receded. There would be no dented fenders, no shattered glass, no proof. Only intention. He drove the rest of the way home in silence. Titan did not settle fully into his seat until the headlights of the house appeared ahead. Rachel was waiting when he called. "Did you get a plate?" she asked. "Too dark, too fast." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I found something." Her voice carried a different tone now, not suspicion, but confirmation. Deltrans is a contract with a private security firm out of Helena. They list services as media risk monitoring and reputational management. Daniel said nothing. They track potential litigation threats, Rachel continued. Activists, former employees, families. A pause. Your name appears in their internal tracking file. Daniel looked across the room at Lily's drawing still resting on the side table. Titan lay near the door, eyes open, watching him. "They're not trying to kill you," Rachel said carefully. "They're trying to discourage you." Daniel understood the distinction. One was impulsive violence. The other was calculated containment. He walked to the window and looked out at the narrow road leading to his house. Snow covered the surface, erasing tired tracks within minutes. He realized then that the truck on the canyon road had not needed to hit him. It only needed to remind him how easily it could. "Dumlai," he murmured under his breath, the phrase forming in his mind as clearly as if someone had spoken it aloud. Stop. He did not feel fear. What he felt was clarity. The pattern was no longer confined to documents and emails. It had stepped onto the road beside him. Titan rose slowly and pressed his shoulder against Daniel's leg, steady and warm. Daniel rested a hand on the dog's head. "We're not done," he said quietly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, covering evidence almost as efficiently as paperwork ever had. The message had been delivered, and Daniel understood it exactly as intended. The snow thinned into brittle patches of ice that week, the kind that cracked underfoot without warning. Daniel had begun to recognize that sound as something familiar, pressure concealed beneath stillness. Rachel called late one evening, her voice lower than usual. "We have a contact," she said. "Anonymous. Internal accounting. He wants to meet off record first." They agreed on a diner outside city limits, a narrow place with faded vinyl booths and a neon coffee sign that flickered unevenly. Daniel arrived early. Titan remained in the truck, watching through the windshield, breath fogging the glass in slow, steady rhythm. The man who entered 15 minutes later carried himself like someone who had rehearsed leaving. His name was Leonard Pike. He was in his early 60s, thin to the point of frailty, with neatly combed white hair and wire-framed glasses perched low on his nose. His suit jacket hung slightly loose on narrow shoulders, and his hands trembled faintly when he removed his gloves, not from age alone, but from the strain of a decision long postponed. Leonard had spent 30 years as a corporate accountant, rising quietly through departments without drawing attention. He believed in numbers because numbers did not lie, unless someone forced them to. Rachel sat across from him, composed and attentive. Daniel listened without interrupting. "I retire next month," Leonard began softly, "which means I stop caring about the cost of speaking." He slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were photocopies of internal ledger entries from Deltrans Logistics. The pages were organized meticulously, highlighted in pale yellow where certain expenses repeated. Under each accident date, an entry appeared labeled Emergency Technical Adjustment Allocation. The amounts varied, but were significant, large enough to imply structural repair or settlement negotiation. Daniel's expression did not shift. "There's more," Leonard continued. "Consulting disbursements." He adjusted his glasses. "Funds transferred to a private consulting entity registered to Councilman Robert Ellison." Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ellison chairs the Municipal Transportation Safety Review Board." Leonard nodded. "The payments began 3 months before the first recorded accident. They increased during contract renewal periods." Robert Ellison was a well-known public figure in Bozeman. Mid-50s, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with carefully styled salt-and-pepper hair and a politician's practiced half-smile. He had built his reputation on infrastructure reform and fiscal responsibility. Few questioned his integrity publicly. Leonard's documentation suggested otherwise. Daniel exhaled slowly. This was no longer a pattern of neglect alone. It was financial insulation. Rachel looked at Leonard. "Why now?" The older man's gaze dropped briefly. "Because I signed off on expense categorizations I knew were misleading. And because someone died who shouldn't have." Daniel did not ask which death he meant. The meeting ended quietly. Leonard left first, shoulders slightly straighter than when he had arrived. Back at home, Daniel crouched beside his truck after Titan began pawing insistently at the undercarriage. The dog's posture was alert, tail stiff but not wagging, nose pressed toward the rear axle. Daniel slid beneath the vehicle with a flashlight. A small magnetic tracking device was affixed near the frame. He removed it carefully. Rachel confirmed the next morning that Deltrans's legal department had authorized third-party surveillance under a broad risk management clause once Daniel filed a formal complaint inquiry. It was technically legal, though ethically gray. "They're monitoring movement, not threatening directly," Rachel said. "It gives them awareness." Daniel placed the device on his workbench and stared at it for a long moment. 3 years ago, rage might have fueled him. Now he felt something steadier. He no longer wanted someone to pay. He wanted the record corrected in daylight. Rachel filed for a formal search warrant citing financial irregularities and potential public corruption. The warrant was approved after a brief hearing, supported by Leonard's affidavit and corroborating maintenance anomalies. 2 days later, investigators entered Deltrans headquarters with court authorization. Daniel did not attend. He remained at his garage, tightening bolts on an engine block with careful precision, while Titan lay near the open door, ears angled toward the road. Rachel called that evening. "We accessed archived internal communications," she said. Her tone carried a quiet intensity. Among the recovered files was a maintenance scheduling report from 3 days before the accident. The truck, driven by Mark Delaney, had been flagged for withdrawal from active rotation pending full brake system replacement. The recommendation was issued by a senior fleet mechanic whose name appeared at the bottom of the report: Samuel Ortega. Samuel Ortega was 38, a former Army mechanic with thick black hair and a neatly trimmed beard that framed a square jaw. He had a reputation for precision and an aversion to shortcuts, traits shaped by his military service where mistakes cost more than money. According to internal notes, he had submitted the withdrawal recommendation citing high risk of hydraulic failure under load. The report had been overridden. Authorization code CW. Charles Whitmore. Rachel continued. The override timestamp places the decision less than 48 hours before dispatch. The mechanic's recommendation was archived but not executed. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He'd pictured the sequence. The warning logged, the override entered remotely, the truck sent out anyway. "This proves knowledge," Rachel said. "They knew the vehicle required full brake replacement and sent it anyway." Daniel finished quietly. Outside, a delivery van passed by his property, slowing cautiously for the icy bend near his driveway. The sound of its brakes carried faintly through the cold air. Daniel walked to the window and watched the taillights fade. He understood now that the crash had not been random failure. It had been a calculated gamble, a decision that weighed cost against consequence and assumes the consequence would fall elsewhere. Rachel's voice softened. "This changes the charge threshold. It's no longer deferred maintenance alone. It's conscious disregard." Daniel rested a hand against Titan's head. The dog leaned into him, steady and warm. "Good," Daniel said quietly. "Let it be conscious." He did not want vengeance. He wanted the decision-makers to answer in a room where nothing could be cropped from the frame. The ledger had spoken. The emails confirmed it. The withdrawal order had been ignored. 3 days before the intersection turned red, the truck should have been parked. Instead, it was cleared. The morning of the hearing arrived under a pale, uncommitted sky, the kind that offered no warmth and no storm, only exposure. Daniel stood outside the municipal courthouse in Bozeman with Titan at his side, one hand resting lightly on the dog's collar. He wore a dark wool coat that fit square across his shoulders, beard trimmed but not softened, his posture straight, without effort. He was not there to accuse. He was there to witness. Inside, the council chamber had been converted into a formal civil review room. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly with reporters, city employees, and residents who had followed the reopening of the case with growing unease. Rachel Hayes stood near the front table, composed and focused, hair pulled back, a stack of binders aligned precisely before her. There was no theatrical energy in her presence, only readiness. Charles Whitmore entered 10 minutes later with legal counsel. He wore a tailored navy suit and a silk tie in muted burgundy, silver hair immaculately combed back, expression controlled but tightened at the edges. His attorney, Daniel Kessler, was a broad-chested man in his early 50s with sharp cheekbones, closely shaved scalp, and a voice known in local courts for its confident cadence. Kessler had built his reputation defending corporate clients from regulatory overreach. He greeted the room with polite nods that did not reach his eyes. Mark Delaney was called first. He approached the witness table slower than his frame suggested he once moved. The years since the accident had left him leaner. His shoulders sloped inward slightly, hands clasped tightly as if bracing against judgment. He wore a simple gray jacket and clean jeans. When he spoke, his voice carried no performance. "I logged the brake issue before dispatch," Mark said steadily. "I was told to complete the route. I was told it had been cleared." Kessler pressed him gently but firmly. "You were the operator of the vehicle. You accepted the clearance." "Yes," Mark replied. "I accepted it because I was told the issue was resolved. I didn't see a mechanic touch the truck. I trusted the authorization." Rachel stepped forward with documented maintenance logs, displaying the timestamps. She laid out the email from Whitmore, instructing delay of maintenance until contract closure. She presented ledger entries detailing post-accident technical adjustment allocations. Each document was projected onto a screen behind her, plain and unembellished. Whitmore's jaw tightened as the emails appeared. He did not avert his gaze. Rachel's final exhibit came from the search warrant executed days earlier. A recovered internal scheduling report authored by Samuel Ortega, the fleet mechanic who had flagged the truck for full brake replacement 3 days prior to the accident. Ortega himself appeared briefly to confirm his authorship. He stood tall and steady, dark hair combed back neatly, beard trimmed, expression measured. His military bearing was unmistakable, his testimony precise. "The vehicle should not have been dispatched," he said simply. Kessler rose smoothly. "Mr. Whitmore's override authority allowed operational decisions based on fleet demand." Rachel responded without raising her voice. "Authority does not negate mechanical physics." A murmur moved through the room. Then came the final piece. Rachel introduced a recovered internal surveillance clip from the original repair yard. The footage, grainy but clear enough, showed the truck in question leaving the yard on the morning of dispatch. It never entered the service bay designated for brake inspection. The timestamp aligned with the digital authorization. Whitmore leaned toward his attorney, whispering briefly. The chair of the Municipal Review Board, Margaret Lowell, called for order. Margaret was in her early 60s, tall and composed, with short, iron-gray hair and a demeanor shaped by decades in public administration. She had built her career on cautious neutrality, but her eyes now carried something heavier: disappointment. The council recessed for deliberation. Daniel remained seated, hands resting on his knees, Titan lying quietly at his feet, head up but still. Reporters whispered. Cameras adjusted. When the council returned, Margaret spoke clearly. "Based on the evidence presented, the board finds sufficient cause to refer this matter for criminal investigation, under charges of falsified safety documentation and negligent homicide. A breath left the room, as if released collectively. Whitmore remained seated, face pale but composed. His attorney leaned in again, murmuring strategy. Outside, as officers prepared formal notice, Rachel approached Daniel. There was no triumph in her expression. "This moves to the district attorney," she said. "It's no longer just regulatory." Daniel nodded once. But the day did not end there. In the afternoon session, District Attorney Gregory Madsen entered the chamber to address preliminary criminal findings. Madsen was a tall, angular man in his late 40s, clean-shaven, with deep-set brown eyes and a habit of speaking slowly, as if weighing each syllable before release. Known for methodical prosecutions, he avoided public spectacle. He carried a thin file in one hand. "During our review," Madsen said evenly, "we have identified 2 additional incidents involving Deltrans vehicles within the past 4 years that share similar maintenance override patterns. These incidents were previously classified as isolated mechanical failure." The room stilled. "Those cases will now be re-examined under the context of systemic operational negligence." Daniel felt the shift before he fully processed the words. It was not relief. It was scale. Emily and Lily had not been casualties of random misfortune, nor had they been targeted. They had been part of a system that calculated risk as acceptable. Whitmore's composure faltered for the first time. His hand tightened visibly against the table's edge. As proceedings adjourned, reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed. Whitmore was escorted quietly through a side exit, flanked by officers. There were no handcuffs in that moment, only paperwork and impending summons. Daniel stepped outside into the cold air. Snow began to fall again, light and steady. Titan stood close against his leg, gaze scanning the perimeter as always. Rachel joined him on the courthouse steps. "It's not finished," she said. "I know," Daniel replied. He did not feel victory. He felt alignment, the record correcting itself one line at a time. Across the street, traffic slowed at the intersection as the light turned red. Engines idled. No one moved until it changed. Daniel watched without turning away. Inside the courtroom, the evidence had been entered. The board had voted. The criminal investigation had begun. And what had once been dismissed as sudden failure was now documented as deliberate disregard. Spring arrived without ceremony, loosening the frost from curbs and softening the edges of snowbanks that had stood like silent witnesses all winter. The city moved again, cautiously, as if testing whether it could trust its own momentum. Charles Whitmore was formally indicted 2 weeks after the hearing. The charges included falsification of safety records and negligent homicide tied to systemic operational decisions. He surrendered through counsel, released on bond pending trial. His face appeared on local news broadcasts nightly, no longer framed by corporate branding but by legal captions. Councilman Robert Ellison resigned under public pressure, citing personal reasons. His carefully controlled half-smile disappeared from campaign posters within days. Mark Delaney's sentence was formally reviewed. While his civil liability remained, criminal responsibility was reduced in light of documented mechanical override. His name was no longer spoken solely in blame. Daniel did not attend the press conferences. He did not speak to reporters. He returned to his garage each morning, opening the wide metal door as the sun lifted over the Bridger Range. Titan followed him everywhere. 6 years old now, coat thick and sable black with silver threading his muzzle, amber eyes steady and intelligent. The dog carried himself with quiet authority, a former canine trained in detection and patrol, disciplined without aggression. When strangers approached the property, Titan did not bark unless necessary. He observed first. Rachel visited one afternoon, stepping from her sedan with a folder tucked under her arm. She wore a charcoal blazer over a pale blue blouse, dark hair tied back loosely. There was relief in her posture, but not celebration. "The city's forming a transportation safety reform board," she said. leaning against the hood of Daniel's truck. Independent oversight, external audits on fleet compliance. She hesitated slightly. They want you, as a technical advisor. Veteran background, mechanical experience, credibility. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, studying her expression rather than the proposal. I'm not a politician, he said quietly. That's why, Rachel replied. He didn't answer. 3 days later, he drove to the intersection of Main and 7th, alone. Titan remained in the passenger seat, ears angled forward, nose pressed lightly to the cracked window. Traffic moved steadily under a pale sky. The crosswalk signals blinked in patient rhythm. Daniel parked across the street and stepped out. The asphalt looked no different than any other intersection in America. Painted lines, metal poles, traffic cameras mounted high. But his chest tightened as he approached the corner. 3 years ago, an 18-wheeler had entered on red. A white cab with corporate lettering now etched permanently into memory. He had avoided this place since the funeral. He stood on the sidewalk where Emily once waited for the light to change. He could see her in his mind clearly. Emily Carter, 34 at the time, tall and slender, with warm olive-toned skin and dark brown hair that fell in soft waves past her shoulders. She had a calm steadiness in her eyes, the kind that made strangers confide in her without meaning to. She worked in community outreach, believed in practical change rather than loud protest. Her voice had never been raised at him, not even during their hardest days. Her strength had been quiet and persistent. Lily had been 7, small and bright-eyed, with freckles across her nose and a laugh that arrived without hesitation. She drew constantly: trucks, mountains, dogs. The week before the accident, she had sketched a white truck with a logo she found too big and silly. Daniel remembered teasing her about artistic exaggeration. He had not known she had simply drawn what she saw. The traffic light shifted from green to yellow. Daniel did not look away. The light turned red. Vehicles slowed in sequence. A delivery van braked early. A pickup truck rolled to a steady stop. An 18-wheeler approached in the far lane. Different company, different driver. Its air brakes released in a controlled hiss as it stopped precisely behind the line. Daniel's breath remained even. For 3 years, red lights had triggered something primal inside him. Crowds, intersections, brake sounds. He had learned to avoid them, rerouting streets to minimize exposure. Now he stood still and watched the discipline of compliance unfold in front of him. Titan whined softly from the truck, not anxious, simply attentive. When Daniel returned to the vehicle, the dog leaned into his leg, tail brushing once against the seat. That evening, Rachel called again. Have you decided? Not yet, he said. You don't have to fight anymore, she added gently. But you could build. He ended the call without promise. Night settled slowly over his property. Daniel stepped onto the porch, Titan beside him. The air carried the scent of thawing earth. He reached for the switch mounted beside the door. The porch light flickered on, casting a steady circle across the driveway and out toward the road. It was a small gesture. It did not change the past. It did not resurrect anyone. A truck approached along the county road, slowing as the traffic signal at the intersection ahead shifted from yellow to red. Daniel watched its brake lights glow steady before the vehicle halted fully. No skid, no hesitation. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel did not turn his head away when the red light shone through the dark. He did not pray. He did not speak. He stood. Titan sat at his side, posture relaxed but vigilant, gaze fixed on the road, as if understanding that vigilance was not fear. It was presence. Daniel did not yet accept the advisory position, but he did not decline it either. The porch light remained on long after traffic thinned, a quiet signal against the night. Somewhere beyond the bend, another driver approached to signal and chose to stop. Daniel watched the red glow hold steady until it changed. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they come quietly, through a red light obeyed, a truth uncovered, a porch light left on in the dark. God does not always remove the storm. Often He gives us the strength to stand still in it, to choose honesty over fear, to stay when walking away would be easier. In our everyday lives, the smallest decisions can become sacred acts of courage. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what helped you keep going in hard seasons. Subscribe for more stories of faith, resilience, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, guide your steps, and protect you wherever you are.